we are living in the age of deception and betrayal. And if people adjust their investing portfolio, their lifestyle, and the locale that they choose to live based on the recognition of that fact, they will be in a far, far better place and statistically have a far, far better chance of survival than the average American. So again, we are living in the age of deception and betrayal. Plan accordingly, invest accordingly, relocate accordingly.
This is Donegan Kaiser, founder of Liberty and Finance. I'm now a licensed gold and silver dealer with Miles Franklin. Call me directly for the physical gold and silver that you need at the best price with personalized, private service from one of the oldest and best respected companies in the business. 30 years strong, A+ rated by the Better Business Bureau, 0 complaints, licensed and bonded, insured delivery or vault storage or IRAs, excellent prices, privacy and confidentiality, pay by check, money order, ACH or wire, satisfaction guaranteed. Call me directly at 419-819-9209 or my associate at 310-562-6400 or email us at kaiser@milesfranklin.com. Welcome back to Liberty and Finance and Reluctant Preppers. We have a returning guest who hasn't been on for some time now. James Wesley Rawles, or Jim Rawles, is the founder of survivalblog.com. He joins us again this Friday, January 15th, 2021. Jim, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
We have more to talk about than we could possibly cover adequately in the time we have available, so let's just jump in and see how much headway we can make. We do have a number of viewers' questions that were submitted ahead of your arrival. In fact, people have been nagging me for many weeks, when are you going to get Jim Rawles back on? So they finally goaded me, and I'm just glad we did. Thank you for making room for us on your calendar. Sometimes we haven't been able to get with you because you're busy writing your next book or whatever, but I'm glad that you were able to make this work out.
Well, again, it's a pleasure to be on, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
Well, first of all, let's talk about the phenomenon we're all living through, this unending nightmare of COVID lockdowns, rule changes and policy changes by authorities, and urban flight that has accompanied that. We've seen people leaving major metropolitan areas in droves, going to what they consider to be more sane or safer areas, and then people in those areas often complain and say, don't bring your crazy big city politics out here. You're in the mountain states, and certainly we've seen enough upsetting things happening in places like Seattle and Portland and Los Angeles to make people want to leave those places. So the first question for you is there any place sane left to move to?
Well, there certainly are. And in addition to the American Redoubt region, which is basically the eastern half of Oregon, eastern half of Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, there's a number of other areas that are quite viable for retreats. One is the Cumberland Plateau region, which is sometimes referred to as the Tennessee Redoubt. And there are areas in Appalachia, there's areas in Arkansas, for example, and the Ozarks that are quite good and quite affordable. There's a huge number of people relocating. I have 2 different sons who are involved in the real estate business, and they tell me that the number of properties that are turning over in midwinter is absolutely unprecedented. Mm-hmm. And not only are the properties selling, that people are so anxious to move, they're actually relocating in the dead of winter. Mm-hmm. So what does that tell you? And there's a huge interest in the inland Northwest region. Property prices are galloping. Properties that traditionally have taken anywhere from 60 to 120 days to sell are now selling in less than 30 days. Listing agents currently are in a situation where properties are turning over so quickly they're not even able to get properties listed in the MLS system, the multiple listing system, before they sell.
Yeah.
And often properties are selling with multiple offers, and a surprising number of properties are selling sight unseen. Not only just holding a property, but actually closing on a property before the seller or before the buyer has ever even seen the property and walked it in person. So there's a lot of angst out there. It's mainly urban people who are looking to relocate. I certainly cannot blame them. And I think that the level of interest in relocating that we saw last summer is going to be even higher next summer. So if anyone has been dilly-dallying, I suggest that they delay no longer. It's really time to make the move now if you can afford to, if your family situation allows it. Obviously, with COVID, a lot of people have learned that they can work from home quite successfully, mm-hmm. and that's only going to further accelerate this process.
We certainly can attest to what you're talking about. We've spoken with my wife, and I have put out videos telling people in our viewership that we are interested in relocating, talking about some of the elements that we're looking for out there, like clean lake shore, that sort of thing. Got a lot of suggestions from people, very helpful. Talked to realtors, made several trips out to look at places, and we're getting, in some regions of the country, we can hardly even get the attention of the realtors. They're just swamped. They're drowning with business and everything, yeah. As you said, people overbidding on properties and that sort of thing.
Yeah, here we are in the middle of January, which is traditionally what's considered the dead season for real estate agents. Basically, between January and March of each year, they're lucky to sell one or two properties. This year, they're running at a summer pace of sales in January. So if people wait until April, May, June this year, I think they're going to find themselves out of luck. That either the prices are going to get away from them, or unless they are true cash buyers where they've already cashed out of their property, mm-hmm. and they literally have cash in pocket and can make a cash offer on a place, anyone who expects to buy a place with financing is probably going to be in a situation where they are outbid by cash buyers.
Something you just said rang a real interesting bell for me, because I've just gotten off interviews with, yesterday was Andy Schechtman, the CEO of Miles Franklin Precious Metals. Today, speaking with Michael Pinto, money manager, and now you, and this echoed phenomenon of there will be a lack of the product to buy because it's all going to be snapped up, is the same thing I'm hearing. And also the second half, you mentioned like end of Q2, Q3. That's the same time frame that I'm hearing in terms of this grave concern that physical tangibles like metals, or in this case, highly desirable real estate, there just may not be to be had. And that's very interesting to be hearing that.
I'm not at all surprised to hear that they're talking the same way, because we are living in a stealth inflationary period right now, where the real inflation rate is basically being hidden by a tremendous amount of stimulus money that's lubricating the system. Once the stimulus payments stop, I think we're going to see consumer price inflation, real estate inflation, precious metals price increases really start to kick in. And that will probably be mid-2021 is where we'll really start to see that in earnest. And again, he who hesitates is lost, especially when it comes to tangibles. When you have a limited supply and presently almost unlimited demand, there's only one way prices are going to go.
Can you talk to us a little bit more about the metals specifically? Because you visited with us about that in the past. We've spoken about platinum in addition to other things. Platinum, I think back at the time you talked to us about it, was like in the 750 range. Now it's seen significant periods of time over $1,000.
Yes.
Are you still focusing on platinum, or what are your thoughts on the metals?
Anytime you can buy platinum below the price of gold, it's a buy. Because traditionally, platinum is sold at a premium above gold. And even if we go into an inflationary depression with a depressed demand for platinum for catalytic converters for cars, which is one of the main industrial uses of platinum, I think we'll still see platinum selling at a premium above spot gold. And again, if you can buy platinum anywhere below spot gold, it's definitely a buy.
Also wanted to talk with you about the political impacts of this relocation. When you have this urban flight, there's the real estate prices. You mentioned things turning faster, prices going up, that sort of thing. What about the very nature and the character of those areas that are sought after as liberty-loving and desirable? First of all, one of the things that's sought after sometimes is low population density. How does that get impacted if everybody wants to move there? And secondly, again, liberty honoring areas. What happens to those areas when people move there from the big city? And are these the conservatives fleeing the big city who want liberty, or are these people who just don't like the way the big city turned out and want to go do that somewhere else?
Well, I'm pleased to report that the majority of people that are moving, at least to the inland Northwest, are liberty-loving Christian and Jewish conservative people. So we're talking about red states that are not going to turn blue or purple or blue. They're red states that are going to turn crimson red, because the majority of people that are moving in are conservative. And demographically, one of the key advantages is a lot of those families are going to be either Reformed Church Christians or Catholics, and they tend to have very large families. There's also a large number of LDS, Mormon people. They tend to have large families. Mm-hmm. So they more than off-balance or counterbalance the liberals moving in. Most liberals have 2 or less children. Most conservatives have 3 or more children, often 5, 6, 7 children. Mm-hmm. So demographically, we've already won this war. It's just a matter of seeing the denouement.
Interesting. Because we've definitely heard from some of these states, and maybe that's why you mentioned like the eastern half of Oregon, the eastern half of Washington, because we've spoken with people who live, for example, out in Montana, and they say, yeah, but stay away from Bozeman or certain parts of the states, because we lost those a long time ago.
Yeah, there's a few counties in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming that are primarily resort locales that tend to have more liberals, but those few liberals in those counties are vastly outnumbered by the conservatives in the rest of those states. So if you have liberal pockets like Missoula, Montana, or Bozeman, Montana, which are both university towns, mm-hmm. or Moscow, Idaho, mm-hmm. or Pullman, Washington, which are both university towns, or Sun Valley, Idaho, for example, which is a resort town, or Sandpoint, Idaho, which is a resort town. Yes, you're going to see more liberals moving in there, but they're vastly outnumbered. And again, a lot of the people that are moving in along with them are conservatives. So I wouldn't, avoid those resort towns or college towns like the plague. I might be more comfortable living one county away, or at least outside of the city limits of those towns, but I don't consider a liberal influx to be a great risk. Okay. Even in those liberal enclaves, again, they're vastly outnumbered.
Interesting.
I was just going to say one more thing, and that is, for example, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, is in Kootenai County, and the new sheriff of Kootenai County just issued a letter stating that he is directing all of his deputies to not enforce any unenforceable laws. And by that, the unspoken is that he's referring to COVID mask laws. But along with that, I think he's also referring to unenforceable gun laws. So a lot of the sheriffs in these counties, even what's considered the few liberal meccas in the American Redoubt states. You have conservative city councils, conservative county boards of commissioners, and conservative sheriffs. So I think that as all this plays out, we'll see, again, red states turning a darker shade of red or even crimson red.
Okay, that's interesting because we've heard predictions that either that would happen or the other would happen, or just basically be spread blue everywhere.
I don't see that.
Could you give us an update? Another topic you've brought up with us in the past is the importance of people being aware that ownership of firearms, which again for liberty-loving people is an important element of maintaining their freedom, is imperiled, and that there may be some strategies people should emphasize in order to be able to do that despite changes of administration.
Sure. Well, with the incoming Biden administration, which I think most people recognize is actually going to be a Harris administration, both of them are virulently anti-gun. All the cabinet picks that they're surrounding themselves with are anti-gun. Biden has promised that from day one, he's going on the warpath against civilian firearms ownership and against the National Rifle Association. I think one of their highest priorities is going to be passing what's commonly called universal background checks. But that's actually a liberal term for a ban on private party sales. That would fundamentally change firearms ownership in the United States. And if this ban were to take effect, it would, at the federal level, it would change things dramatically. Because right now in 34 states, it is still legal for me to sell a gun to my neighbor without a paper trail, or for me to go attend a gun show and buy a gun from another private party who's a resident of the same state without a paper trail, or to take out a want ad in the local newspaper to buy or sell. Any firearm that has completed its transit in interstate commerce becomes a intrastate firearm, a used gun, that's outside of federal jurisdiction. The plan that the Biden administration has is to basically hyperextend the Commerce Clause to state that the sales of used modern firearms inside of a state somehow have a federal nexus, saying that somehow that local sale of a used gun somehow affects interstate commerce.
Right.
Obviously it doesn't, but that's what they're going to claim. And if they are successful at passing universal background checks, again, it's actually a bit of leisure domain for a ban on private party transfers. Everything, all guns made after 1898 would have to go through a dealer with a National Instant Check System, a NICS background check, and you'd have to fill out a Form 4473, and that sale would have to be recorded in the dealer's bound book, and essentially it would be a paperworked sale. Everybody can see that's coming. It's one of the highest priorities for the Biden administration, and once it does come, it'll basically destroy gun shows as we know them right now in 34 states. The only exception will be guns that were made in or before 1898. And that represents less than 0.5% of firearms in circulation. It's a minuscule number. And if we do have universal background checks, I expect the prices of pre-1899 guns to go through the roof.
Now, you had brought this topic up over a year ago with us, and how has that played out?
Well, thankfully, with Donald Trump in office, there was no change at the federal level. Excuse me. But with Biden coming in, I believe that we've already seen prices creep up about 20 or 30% on antique guns. I expect the prices of antique guns to double, triple, or even quadruple in the 4 years that Biden is supposed to be in office.
Interesting. If we could turn our attention to some of those viewer questions.
Sure.
But before we do, though, tips for people who are interested in taking you up on this suggestion of that they should look into these older guns. Where can they find them?
Well, the best place is at your local gun show, and there is a number of references, one of which I wrote on the internet, which is the pre-1899 Cartridge Firearms Act, or Firearms FAQ, and that is basically a listing of models of guns, and for the ones that were made both before and after 1898, it lists the serial number breaks showing which guns of a particular model, say, for example, a Swiss model 1896/11, which was made both before 1899 and after 1898. If you had one with a serial number under, I believe it's 326,000, that is an antique gun. If it's over that serial number, then it's a modern gun. Right now, the difference in prices are not that much, maybe 15 or 20% difference in value for an antique versus a modern gun of the exact same model and the exact same condition. If we have universal background checks, that serial number break will make a huge difference. So I recommend that people, before they go to gun shows, print out a copy of that pre-1899 FAQ and carry it with them, so they'll be able to identify which guns are antique and which are not. I consider, from an investment standpoint, pre-1899 guns to be a huge opportunity. But just from a practical standpoint, if we end up with a very anti-gun administration where people are literally going to have to hide their modern guns, at least with their antique guns, they'll still be able to go to the range, they'll still be able to go hunting, they'll still be able to defend themselves, albeit with older guns. We're talking old revolvers and old bolt-action Mausers and old Winchesters, for example. At least those are still practical guns that shoot modern cartridges, and people will still be able to have those out visible, and the federal government at least won't be able to say anything about them because they're outside of federal jurisdiction.
Wow. So
gun shows are the main opportunity. There's a number of internet sites like Arms List, gunbroker.com, gunsamerica.com, and so on, where you can find antique guns listed. And the easiest way to find them, of course, is to first do your homework, figure out which models you're looking for, and then look for keywords in those listings to track down the antique guns. And then you have to be absolutely sure of the serial number on those guns, unless it's, for example, a Swedish Mauser that has the date of manufacture stamped right on the receiver ring. There's a few guns like that. Also, some of the Spanish Mausers are dated on the receiver ring, where it's very clear it's an antique gun. There's also a lot of Mausers made by the Ludwig Loewe company, which went out of business in 1897, that are very easy to identify as an antique without seeing the serial number. But generally, you have to get smart on which guns are antique and which ones aren't. Because right now, you can walk into a gun show, and some of the dealers are going to have a mix of guns out on their table and not even recognize the fact that one or two of them are antique, and yet they'd be selling them at the same price as modern guns. That's where the real opportunity is for a savvy investor.
Okay, so you really have to be educated on this. You got to have your cheat sheet along. Okay, yep. Interesting.
And there's a lot of guns that are quite practical to shoot. And again, in fairly modern calibers, like you can find Smith & Wesson double action top break revolvers in 44 Smith & Wesson or 4440. That's the old 44 Winchester cartridge. You can find double action top break revolvers in 38 Smith & Wesson, 41 long Colt. You can find bolt action rifles in most of the Mauser calibers, like 6.5 Swedish, 7x57 Mauser, 7.65 Argentine Mauser, or a lot of the old Winchesters in calibers like 25-35 or 30-30, which are still factory made. But if you buy them in the right serial number range, you're getting an antique. And the advantage of having antiques is not apparent to most people yet, but just wait until we have universal background checks. Suddenly, everyone's going to wake up to the real value of these guns, and their prices are going to absolutely gallop.
It also reminds me of what we've heard about some of the pre-1933 numismatic coins. Normally, we don't push those because they can be quite costly, but right now we have low premiums on those, almost at the same price as modern bullion coins. And
yeah, so you might as well buy exempt pre-33 coins.
Right. And, there's no guarantee that the rules won't change. Goodness gracious, this year, how many rules have we seen change? But at least that's the rules as we know them. So,
right.
Yeah. We'd like to turn our attention, if we could, to some of the viewers' questions that have been submitted ahead of your arrival here.
Sure.
And they're quite active. And it's interesting because people really do appreciate the perspective that you bring to this whole thing about strategic locations and just so many aspects of preparedness that they are having many different types of questions interested in. So I'll go to those. We have John Galt, who's in the vein of what we've been talking about. He says, I moved to a rural area, 75% Trump in 2020 in the 2020 county results, but every time I shoot my guns, I now have to call the sheriff's non-emergency number before I start, because after 2 times of being called on and told I'm doing nothing wrong, I head the snitches off before they call. My question is, my closest neighbor is half a mile away, and if I'm not safe from authoritarian mindset out here, where is left? I've heard rumors that Texas, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming are all having the same problems as socialists flee the cities. So you've already weighed in on that, but specifically about the ability to use firearms and how to navigate perhaps the changing cultural waters that might be happening.
Yeah, there's areas in the eastern United States and even in the South in some places where some of the people that have moved in are anti-gun. And yes, conceivably you could get the sheriff called. But in most of the inland Northwest region, the American Redoubt region, it's common as a common occurrence to hear gunshots all the time. And people target shooting, sometimes even shooting rapid fire, or people shooting at tannerite exploding targets that go off with a huge concussive boom. Nobody calls the sheriff. It's just, you're just hearing your neighbors having a good time. Or as they say locally here, that's the sound of freedom. So it all depends on where you live. If some of your listeners think that moving to the New Jersey Pine Barrens or to Vermont or perhaps to New Hampshire is really moving to the boonies, they may be kidding themselves. Mm-hmm. It's only when you move to the really lightly populated regions in the western United States that you run into real firearms freedom and a mentality that's still very old-fashioned, where people don't get panicky when they hear gunshots, even very rapid-fire gunshots.
Interesting. We have a question from Carolina Contracting who says, according to the Land Report, and we're seeing this on multiple outlets as well, including the New York Post and others, Bill Gates is now the single largest owner of farmland in the United States. Some of these reports just came out today. So the question is obviously very concerning. What are James's thoughts?
Well, it's not unusual for liberal investors and corporate moguls to buy large tracts of land, mainly farmland and ranch land. But they look at it as more of an investment rather than a survival retreat. And in terms of the total percentage of land that they hold, it's still relatively small. Now, you could have people like Ted Turner, for example, who owns huge tracts of land in Wyoming, and I think he owns some in Montana. A lot of these ranches he's never even seen himself. He just bought them sight unseen, probably through a property management or ranch management company. He was convinced by his financial advisors that it was a good investment, that he was paying under market for them. I don't really consider him a neighbor. Even if he owned a piece of property right near me, he really wouldn't be a neighbor. His name may be on the title to that property. My chances of ever coming face to face with him would be relatively slim. And it doesn't surprise me that someone like Bill Gates has diversified into tangibles. Let's face it, billionaires are not stupid people. They're very savvy investors. And when they see tangible investments like currently producing farmland or ranch land that's already stocked with cattle, to them, they're looking at that as money in the bank and a way to diversify their portfolio out of dollars and into tangibles. It doesn't surprise me at all to see that happening. But again, the percentage of the land that they hold is still relatively small, even when they're buying large tracts of land. The county where I live is so lightly populated that it doesn't even have a single stoplight, and that county is about the size of the state of Delaware, and the population of that county is under 40,000 people, 2/3 of whom live in the county seat, just that one town. So there's a tremendous amount of elbow room out here. Most people in the East who haven't traveled extensively in the lightly populated regions of the West really have no idea how empty it truly is. And even if the population of my county and surrounding counties were to double or triple, it would still be incredibly rural and still incredibly lightly populated. When you go from a population density of 2 people per square mile, and you run that all the way up to 6 or 7 per square mile, it's still hardly any people. The old saying is twice nothing is still nothing. Well, that's the situation we're in the lightly populated counties of the Western United States. And I encourage any of your listeners who are serious about finding a rural retreat to just get out and look. And it's a good idea to come take a look in the dead of winter to see what elevation you feel comfortable at living. Because especially in the Western United States, elevation and solar exposure make a huge difference in terms of how comfortable a place is to live. So if you find a place that's at low elevation with a southern or western exposure, you may end up with snow on the ground only 2 or 3 months out of each year. But if you go up just a couple of thousand feet and buy a piece of property with a northern exposure, you might have snow on the ground for 7 months out of each year. So again, elevation and exposure make a huge difference. Do your due diligence. Take a look at property in the dead of winter to see where you feel comfortable living.
I would assume that the concern that maybe people were having who posted this question about Bill Gates and agricultural land might be more around the notion that he's tended to be very outspoken and influential about policy changes in many areas. He's gotten into not just obviously the information processing, but into vaccines.
Well, he's very active with vaccines, for example.
Yeah, that sort of thing. And then the other possibility that they might have been concerned about was about the food supply. And if he's so much into nanotechnology and biological innovation or whatever, is that going to affect our ability to get natural organic food or whatever in the future?
It's conceivable. I don't think it's a major threat. Obviously, Bill Gates is all about making money. So I don't think that there's any huge threat that he's going to want to turn productive farmland into fallow ground, or that he's going to insist that, Monsanto genetically engineered crops are the only thing grown on his land. I really don't think it's an issue. But
Okay.
as time goes on, we'll see what plays out. But I would be surprised at all to see that Bill Gates changes his portfolio 4 or 5 years down the road. We'll see what happens.
Another question about, you were talking about different regions that have different character and some becoming, perhaps going from red to crimson red. Jonathan Whiting asked, do you think Texas will secede, and if so, will the American readout and other states follow?
I don't think secession is necessarily the option that'll be pursued. I think it's more likely partition. So we may see the people in Texas ask to have the state of Texas, because it's so huge. I mean, you could fit 3 Californias in Texas. It's a huge state. There's no reason why Texas couldn't be broken up into about 5 or 6 states. And that, if say they had 5 states, that would give the state of Texas 10 senators. That's the real political advantage to partition rather than secession. And as I mentioned earlier, with the American Redoubt Project, we are only looking at the eastern half of Washington and the eastern half of Oregon, which are the conservative dry sides of those states east of the Cascades. If those states were to partition successfully, they would be politically removed from the liberal politicians of the western halves of those states. So I think partition rather than secession is the route that will be pursued. Any attempts at true secession from the union of the 50 states would probably be stomped down very quickly. And the power of the purse of all the federal spending that goes back into states through federal highway dollars in particular would be felt very quickly. And anyone hoping to secede probably would be shouted down by people within their own states saying, hey, we're going to lose all the federal benefits if we withdraw from the union.
Related topic is this partitioning has certainly been floated on the other side of the political spectrum by saying, gee, they could partition the District of Columbia into, I forget how many, 500 different, or however many huge number, just to stack the legislature. So are we likely to see, in your view, an actual phenomenon that you're describing? If multiple states, if there's basically a battle of partitioning war between red states and blue states to see who can generate the most representatives and senators in a rapid amount of time.
That very well could happen. If you look at the partition proposal that was put forth in California a few years back, they wanted to partition California to something like 7 states, which would give them 14 senators. It's all a matter of geography and politics. And where those intercede, I don't know. But we'll probably see it once one state is able to successfully partition, we will then see a cascade of other states, basically following the lead of what happened when West Virginia seceded or partitioned from Virginia. There are plenty of precursors. I mean, if you look at Vermont, for example, or Virginia and West Virginia, there's plenty of precedents for this. And again, once the partitioning starts, it will probably accelerate, and maybe even to absurd proportions, where you end up with 7 states of California and 5 states of Texas and so on. A lot of these western states have a lot of room and not too much population. A state like Montana or Wyoming could very easily partition into 3 states, and they would have a minimum of 1 congressman for each of those states.
Mm-hmm.
It would, and of course 2 senators for each of those states,
Mm-hmm.
which is even more important.
Well, in this environment where we've seen previously unimaginable things unfolding in the past year, it's terrifying to think of that scenario you just described. Here's another related question from Ron Swanson, who says, what is Mr. Rawls' opinion on the states that broke their own election laws, investigated themselves, and found nothing illegal, and certifying their results, i.e. an unconstitutionally elected government? So your opinion on that whole process and what you think the fallout of it is going to be in our lives?
Well, obviously the Democrats have proven that they can manipulate votes however they'd like without any real repercussions. That's the scary part of the whole 2020 election. I don't think that we have a true representative Republican form of government anymore in this country. The electoral process has been thoroughly subverted. We cannot trust election results from now on. And unfortunately, they say that in every body of law, there's a remedy and a recourse. I don't see much recourse in this instance, because if you have a majority Democrat legislature and a sitting Democrat governor in a state, I don't see how they're going to do anything except certify elections that were blatantly stolen.
We interviewed Dr. Edwin Vieira, constitutional attorney, and he talked about that. He said, no, there is. He says if fraud occurred and the people who perpetrated it end up in the highest offices of the nation and are determined to execute purges of enemies of their persuasion, then he said there is no recourse within the Constitution. He says there's a recourse you have to go to a higher level of law. There is recourse within the Declaration of Independence.
Right. Well, the Constitution is the law of the land, but if the Constitution is consciously ignored, we no longer have a constitutional republic.
It's disturbing times, and there's a lot of questions that we've gotten asking for your perspective on additional things. You mentioned earlier about metals and tangibles. There's a couple related questions
Sure.
From that. One question is about the potential for digital or cryptocurrencies. J. Thomas Reset says, how will they roll the U.S. dollar into crypto? Will they just outlaw Bitcoin?
Well, I think he's hit the nail on the head, and that is that as soon as the sovereign cryptos roll out, the attacks on private, opaque cryptos will intensify. You'll see attempts to shut down cryptocurrency exchanges. You'll see greater tax scrutiny. You might see cryptos banned altogether in some countries. Again, though, the turning point will be when each country starts issuing their own sovereign crypto. And at that point, all sense of humor on the part of those governments will disappear. They're going to want absolute transparency in cryptos. They're going to want them to be, at least, if not government-issued cryptos, at least government-sanctioned cryptos, and cryptos that have full visibility by taxing officials.
Mm-hmm.
That's to them, that's the most important thing. Not whose name is on the crypto, but a matter of transparency versus opacity. If you have an opaque crypto that can't be tracked and can't be taxed, governments hate them.
Related question here from Michael Annenberg, who says, will silver ultimately be sold for dollars, or will people pay for products and services across the barrelhead? So barter or do you think dollars are going to remain around as our currency of transaction?
Well, I don't think there's no hope under the current political system of restoring the U.S. dollar to a sound backing where we have real specie behind the American dollar. We're not going to see that happen with anything short of a total collapse and a reset. With the current system in place, I think that obviously people are going to increasingly see the value of not just cryptocurrencies, but also precious metals as a means of exchange, as an alternative to increasingly inflated fiat currencies. Obviously, inflation has been kept artificially low for an extended period of time because of interest rate manipulations by the U.S. Treasury and by the Federal Reserve banking cartel, which is a private cartel. I can see that ending fairly soon. As interest rates rise, we're going to see the top come off of the market. There will be no limits. We could see gold at $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 an ounce. We could see silver at $200, $300, $400 per ounce very easily and very quickly, because these are remarkably thin markets. There's just not a lot of tangible precious metals out there versus the paper currency and electronic dollars that are in circulation. And even if just 5% of the population were to hedge into precious metals, you would see them just explode in price. And I think we've seen the recent run-up in Bitcoin partly as a precursor of that, because people can see inflation on the horizon, and they're looking at cryptocurrencies as an alternative and as a hedge on inflation. And of course, gold and silver are traditional hedges on inflation. The upside potential is huge.
Also, we have a concern coming out about, we've seen some was supposedly reported as potentially state-sponsored terrorism of cyber hacking and cyber attacks recently that affected not only government agencies but also potentially control centers that could affect the electrical grid. Caton Inn asks, where are we now in someone being able to possibly knock the leg out of society by permanently taking down the grid?
Well, I've been warning for many years at my website, my blog site, survivalblog.com, that the software that's used to control power grids and other utilities is very vulnerable. This is system control and acquisition and data systems, what are commonly called SCADA systems. Mm-hmm. A lot of that uses antiquated software. It's often it's kind of cobbled together. Started out back in the punch card era of computing in the 1950s and 60s, and has gradually been added to with extra communications layers added on. And each of those communications layers, first with dial-up and later with internet access, each has their own vulnerability. So the SCADA software is incredibly vulnerable. The points of intrusion are enormous, very widespread possibilities for intrusion into those SCADA systems. So it's quite possible, and we've already seen some probing attacks, I think probably setting us up for a widespread cyber war at some point in the future, where someone will attempt to take down the power grids, water utilities, natural gas pipelines, and so on, all at once. Basically a fire sale type situation where they attempt to completely take down our infrastructure. And given the vulnerability of the SCADA software that's out there, I think it's a very large, genuine threat. And as we were talking about earlier, your only real safety is in a lightly populated rural area where you have either an off-grid power system, or you have a local power co-op in an energy-producing area that can detach itself from the national power grids. There's three grids: an eastern grid, a western grid, and a Texas grid. Where if the national grids go down, those three major grids go down, the local power utilities will be able to reconstitute, even with a matter of minutes, to bring local power back up. But the areas where that's going to happen are fairly, it's only a small portion of the country. It's mainly the Pacific Northwest, the Inland Northwest, and the Four Corners region in like northern New Mexico, for example, where they're power exporting regions where they're either large natural gas fields or where there's abundant hydroelectric power. Those are the regions where the power grid is much less vulnerable. Granted, there could be a hack attack that could bring down the eastern grid, the western grid, or the Texas grid, but in the areas that are power exporters, you'll only see the grid go down very briefly.
In that scenario, do you think there's credible risk that this could be not necessarily an external threat, but a control measure by an overreach of government that has a vested interest in the people being dependent upon handouts or controlled subsidies and so on from the central authorities?
Yeah, but there's always kind of the political overtones, but you've got to recognize that whether you're talking about food or you're talking about power, right now the people that have the real control are at the consuming end of both of those chains. If in the event of a national crisis, it'll be people at the producing end of those chains that'll control they'll hold the power, really. It's the people who are making the power that have the on-off switch, is I guess the simplistic way of looking at it. Now, currently, when you have major blocks of power producers with power coming out of, for example, the Grand Coulee Dam, the board of directors of the organization that controls that power may currently be sitting in very populated regions of the western United States. But the power itself is coming from a very lightly populated region. Mm-hmm. And in the event of a crisis, it'll be very interesting to see how this all plays out. Mm-hmm. I don't think they're going to be able to bypass the local users of that power in the inland Northwest, for example. Mm-hmm. They're not going to say you're going to send all your power into the grid and you're going to disconnect your local customers from the grid. I don't think that'll fly very long.
Certainly a lot of food for thought. No one would have believed, we could probably each come up with a half a dozen or more things that happened in the past year that no one would have believed if we'd have told them, or at least 90% of the people wouldn't have believed if we'd have told them a year ago that they were going to happen. So we'll see. Right. It's certainly eventful times, upside down times, disconcerting times that we're living in. If you would leave us with maybe what you're most gravely concerned about and trying to pay attention to, or get people to pay attention to, and then something you find as an element of hope.
Well, I'm fond of saying that we are living in the age of deception and betrayal. And if people adjust their investing portfolio, their lifestyle, and the locale that they choose to live based on the recognition of that fact, they will be in a far, far better place and statistically have a far, far better chance of survival than the average American. So again, we are living in the age of deception and betrayal. Plan accordingly, invest accordingly, relocate accordingly.
And what do you see as an element of hope in that? Is it that awareness itself and the decisions that people can make coming out of it?
Look at the growth of, whether it's Trump supporters or people who read QAnon or whatever, people are waking up to the big picture. And my real sense of hope first comes from Christ, and secondarily comes from the recognition that people are waking up, that the mainstream media has pretty well marginalized itself by the nonsense they're peddling every night on the evening news. They've marginalized themselves. So alternative media is on the rise. Truth and freedom are on the rise. And regardless of the machinations of what goes on inside of the DC Beltway, I hold out a lot of hope for the American people and our traditional way of life, for God-fearing, freedom-loving Americans. And I'm truly quite hopeful and confident that we're on the right side of history, and that as time goes on, we will see a division between fake news and real news, and a division between traditional culture and modern liberal coastal culture that will become all too apparent, and it will all play itself out very quickly.
Jim Rawles, founder of survivalblog.com, thank you as always for joining us here on Liberty and Finance and Reluctant Preppers.
Thank you so much, and I pray the 91st Psalm for you and all your viewers.
Thank you. If you've decided that now is the right time for you to protect your family's financial future by acquiring physical precious metals, gold and silver, I'm delighted to let you know that I have now become a licensed dealer's representative for Miles Franklin, one of the oldest and most trusted names in bullion dealerships. And we can provide you with physical delivery to your personal possession, or to professional vault storage, or precious metals IRAs. Just email me at libertyandfinance@protonmail.com, and please include your name and phone number in your email to libertyandfinance@protonmail.com. We'll get right back with you and find out how to best meet your needs so that you can either begin or increase your acquisition of physical precious metals now and protect your family's future starting today. To acquire gold and silver, just go to libertyandfinance.com. When the main site comes up, click on Bullion Sales. That's libertyandfinance.com, Bullion Sales. You'll see my name, Dunnigan Kaiser, my phone number, and my associate, Kaiser Johnson, his phone number, our email, libertyandfinance@protonmail.com.